Mix tapped the pencil laid against the cold cicadilla, a sharp click that dissolved into the drumming of the afternoon rain. Water slid down the pane in greasy rivulets, distorting the view of Rillington Place until the brickwork resembled wet meat. He watched a single droplet swell at the top of the window frame, tremble and fall. 1. The count restarted in his mind, a rhythmic incantation designed to hold the chaos at bay. 2. 3. Outside, the sky hung low and bruisedy, a airing in the smoke from 1,000 chimneys back onto the streets, where it mingled with the acrid scent of coal dust and rotting cabbage. 4. 5. He shifted in the wooden chair, its legs scraping against the floorboards with a grating shriek that made his teeth ache. The room reeked of damp plaster and the stale tobacco he had been rationing since Tuesday. Upon his lap lay the ledger, a cheap exercise book with a cracked spine, its pages filled with columns of figures that held meaning for no one but him. Dates, times, weather conditions. The frequency of comings and goings at number 10 formed a fortress built of ink, a desperate attempt to impose geometry upon a world that preferred to slide into mud. 6. 7. A removal van idled at the curb opposite, its engine coughing black exhaust that curled around the legs of passing pedestrians. The driver, a broad man in a cap pulled low against the drizzle, hauled a crate from the doorway of Numberton. He stepped onto the external staircase, his boot slipping slightly on the whetstone. Mix leaned forward, his breath fogging the glass, which wiped away with the heel off his hand. The driver paused, 1 foot planted in the 12th step, the other hovering. He hesitated, shifting the weight of the crate, looking down at Thetred as if it might bite. 13. The driver stepped down. Mix exhaled a long, shuddering breath that fogged the window once more. He uncapped his fountain pen, the nib scratching loudly in the quiet rumors he logged the event. 1403, removal man. Hesitation and step 13, Badomen. The ink bloomed the cheap paper, a small black wound. He did not know why the number mattered, only that it did. It was the gap in the railing where his sister had slipped, the number offstairs in the tenement back in Bethnal Green, the count-off beats between a lightning flash and the thunder that promised destruction. Order was Athens' skin over the rot, and if you picked at it, the whole thing sloughed off. 8. 9. Down on the pavement, Thurane had turned the world to a grey wash. Men in Macintoshes hurried past, collars turned up, eyes fixed on the ground. Women clutched shopping bags, their heads bowed against the wind. No one looked at number 10. No one ever looked properly. They saw the white paint, the neat curtains, the respectable silhouette of John Christie adjusting his tea in the hallway mirror. Anthe saw what they wanted to see. A gentleman, Awadoa, a man who helped with forms and knew the price of tobacco. Mix knew better. He had seen the way Christie's eyes moved, not looking at people but past them, calculating distances, measuring space for things that did not fit in a normal house. 10. 11. The pencil snapped. Mick stared at the broken point, a jagged shard of graphite staring back like a dark eye. He cursed under his breath, a sharp, guttural sound that startled him. Superstition demanded start the count over. 13 was the target, and breaking the tool mid-count was a fracture in the ritual, a crack in the defenses. He reached for the pencil sharpener on the sill, his fingers trembling slightly. The metal was cold, biting into his palm. He twisted the wood, watching the shavings curl out, grey ribbons falling onto the windowsill. 12. A flash of color caught his attention, startling him mid-turn. On the pavement below, a woman walked against the flow of the crowd. Gwyneth Prysish wore a blue coat that seemed too bright for the day, a slash of vivid life against the monochrome street. She was not rushing. She walked with a slow, deliberate grace, her head high, unaware of the van still idling outside number 10, unaware of the man who had just hesitated on the 13th step. Mix pressed his face to the glass, his nose leaving a smear of oil on the pane. She stopped to adjust her shoe, leaning against the railings. A red handkerchief slipped from her pocket, fluttering down to land on the wet cobblestones. 13. The count completed itself in High's head just as she bent to retrieve it, but the wind caught the fabric first, skittering it across the stones towards the gutter. Mix did not think. He grabbed his coat from the back of the chair, the wool heavy and smelling of mothballs, and shoved his arms into the sleeves. He needed to todge it out. The air in the room had become thick, suffocating, charged with the Statikoff unfinished business. He needed tobacco, yes, but more than that, he needed to beware the rain was real, where the numbers could be counted on something other than glass. He took the stairs two at a time, ignoring the creak of the 13th tread in his own building, daring it to break beneath his weight. The front door off the rooming house stuck, requiring a shoulder check to swing open into the damp afternoon. The air outside hit him like a physical blow, cold and wet and smelling of exhaust. He pulled his collar up, keeping his head down, and walked towards the spot where the red handkerchief had landed. It was gone, washed into the gutter or taken by the wind. Gone, he muttered, the word snatched away by the breeze. Looking for something, Mr. Cellini. The voice came from his left, smooth and polite, cutting through the sound of Thurane. Mix flinched, turning to see John Christie standing by the gate of Numberton. He held an umbrella, black and perfectly dry, thought rain fell heavily around him. In his other hand, he held a cigarette, the tip glowing a faint orange in the gloom. He smiled, a small, tight movement off the lips that did not reach his eyes. Mix swallowed the reply before it could shape itself. His throat clicked, a dry sound lost in the wet hush of the street. He shook his head, a jerky motion that sent rain flying from his hair onto his collar. Nothing, Mix said, dropped a coin. Christie stepped closer. The umbrella did not tilt, shielding only himself, leaving Mix exposed to the downpour. Water streamed down Mix's nose, stinging his eyes, but he did not blink. He watched the hand holding the cigarette. The fingers were long, pale, stained yellow at the tips like old parchment. They did not tremble, they never trembled. A man who shook could not perform the delicate work Mix suspected him of. There was a precision to Christie's stillness that felt artificial, as if he were holding his breath for hours at a time. A coin, Christie repeated. The word hung in the air, flat and unconvincing. He took a drag, the cherry glowing brighter, then exhaled a stream of smoke that mixed with the steam rising from the wet pavement. Careful where you tread, Mr. Cellini. The gutters are deep today. Things disappear quickly. He gestured with the cigarette towards the road, where the removal van had vanished around the corner, leaving only a smear of oil on the cobblestones. Mix followed the gesture, his eyes darting to the doorframe of number 10. The wood was painted white, peeling slightly at the bottom where the damp rose from the ground. Something caught the light there, a glint of paper wedged between the jamb and the brick. I'll be more careful, Mix said. He took a step forward, intending to pass, to put the door behind him, but his feet moved of their own accord, angling towards the glint. Christie did not move to block him. He simply watched, his head tilted slightly like a bird observing a worm struggle in the mud. The smoke curled around his face, obscuring his eyes for a second, then cleared. He lifted his left hand to brush a speck of dirt from his cuff. The handkerchief he used was grey, matching the sky, matching the stone, matching the ash of his cigarette. He wiped the fabric once, twice, then tucked it back into his pocket with a snap of elastic. Segment 1. Ethel says the rain brings out the dirt, Christie said, his voice conversational light. Ethel, Mix asked. The name slipped out before he could check it. He knew Ethel Christie was a ghost in this house, a voice rarely heard, a shape rarely seen. To hear her name spoken so casually, as if she were merely upstairs polishing the silver, made the hair on his arms stand rigid against the wool of his coat. My wife, Christie said, smiling again with that tight movement of skin. Resting, she finds the noise of the van exhausting. He shifted his weight, blocking the path to the door entirely now, not aggressively, but just standing there as a wall of polite flesh. Mix stopped. The distance between them was 3 feet, close enough to smell the scent coming off Christie's clothes, which was not tobacco but something sharper and chemical that clung to the fibers like a second skin. It was disinfectant, or something stronger, something used to clean meat from bone. Mix's hand twitched in his pocket, fingers brushing the notebook where he had logged the van's hesitation. 13, the number burned in his mind. He needed to see the paper in the doorframe. He needed to know if it was a number, a date, a name. The urge was physical, a hook behind his navel pulling him forward. I should get on, Mix said. Shop's closing. Of course, Christie stepped aside. The movement was smooth, fluid, as if he had planned the exact timing of the retreat. Don't let me keep you from your tobacco, Mr. Cellini, though I'd watch the step. It's uneven. Mix moved past him. His shoulder brushed the lapel of Christie's jacket. The fabric was dry, warm. He reached the doorframe, feigning a stumble to dip his head. His hand shot out, not to steady himself, but to snag the paper. It came away easily, stuck only by a bead of resin or dried glue. He straightened, tucking the scrap into his palm before Christie could see what it was. "Clumsy," Mix muttered. "We all are," Christie said, watching Mix's hand rather than the face, just the hand, in the end. Mix did not run. Running would confirm the guilt he felt burning in his cheeks. He walked, one foot, then the other. He counted the steps away from number 10. 1, 2, 3, he did not look back. He could feel Christie's gaze on his neck, a physical weight, heavy and cold as a wet stone. He turned the corner onto the main road, the noise of traffic swelling to meet him, buses hissing air brakes, horns blaring in the grey fog. Only then did he stop, leaning against the wet brick of a shopfront, and opened his hand. The paper was yellowed, brittle with age, a pawn ticket. The ink was faded, blue turning to grey, but the numbers were still legible. He held it close to his face, shielding it from the rain with his body. Item 1 pram, condition, good. Date, 14 March 1949. Name, T. Evans. Mix stared at the date. The rain blurred the edges of the paper, making the numbers swim. He blinked hard, forcing them into focus. March 1949. He knew the story. Everyone in Notting Hill knew the story, though they spoke of it in whispers over tea. Timothy Evans had left Rillington Place in January. He had told the police he was going to Wales. He had told them his wife and child were with him. But the police had found him alone, confused, claiming he had killed his wife in a fit of anger, claiming the baby was still inside the house, claiming he had left them there. They had searched. They had found nothing. They had hanged Evans for the murder of his child, believing the wife was gone too, vanished into the wind. But this ticket was dated March, arriving 2 months after Evans claimed to have left, and 2 months after the police said the family was broken. Why would Evans pawn a pram in March if he was in custody, if he was dead? Mix turned the paper over. On the back, in a different hand, neat and precise, a single word was written in pencil: stored. The wind picked up, snatching at the ticket, trying to pull it from his fingers. Mix gripped it tighter, the paper cutting into his palm. He looked back down the street towards Rillington Place. The grey facade of 10 Rillington stood silent. The window where Christie had stood was dark now, no light, no movement, just the house, waiting. He folded the ticket once, twice, until it was a small, hard square against his skin. The rain continued to fall, counting down the seconds, but Mix had lost the count. The numbers no longer added up. The equation was broken, and the sum was something far heavier than a missing pram. He shoved the ticket into his pocket, next to his notebook, and began to walk again, faster this time, towards the shop, towards the tobacco, towards anything that felt real. But the chemical smell of Christie's coat lingered in his nose, masking the scent of the rain, masking the truth he now carried in his pocket like a loaded gun. The ticket bit into his palm, a sharp, papery edge digging into the lifeline. Stored. Not sold, not lost, stored, as if the pram were a coat left at a cloakroom, waiting for a customer who would never return. Mix pressed his thumb over the word, smudging the pencil graphite until the letters blurred into a grey smear, matching the damp brick against his shoulder. The rain had stopped falling, leaving the air thick with a suspended mist that clung to the wool of his coat, heavy and suffocating. It smelled of wet dog, coal smoke, and the copper tang of old blood, though that last scent existed only in his head, a phantom conjured by the date on the paper. March 1949. Evans was already in custody by then. The noose had been waiting. The trial was a theatre piece performed for a gallery that wanted a villain, not a puzzle. They had hanged a man for killing a child that might still have been breathing when the verdict came down. A baby whose mother had vanished into the ether of a lie told by the man standing in the doorway of the terraced house on Rillington Place. Mix pushed himself off the wall. His legs felt stiff, the joints creaking like the floorboards in his own room when the temperature dropped. He needed to move. Standing still made the numbers swirl, made the logic of the street dissolve into the chaotic arithmetic of his fear. He walked towards the corner shop, the pavement slick under his shoes, each step a deliberate placement of weight. Left foot, Right foot, do not count, do not start the sequence again. If he reached 13 before the lamp post, something bad would happen. If he skipped a number, the sky would fall. He forced his mind to blank, to focus on the red handkerchief still balled in his other pocket, the one belonging to Gwyneth. He had forgotten to give it back. The thought struck him with the force of a physical blow, stopping him mid-stride near a puddle reflecting the bruised purple of the evening sky. Gwyneth. She had walked past him earlier, a flash of vibrant life against the monochrome decay of Notting Hill. She wore a blue coat, too thin for the weather, and her hair was pinned up in a style that defied the gloom. When she dropped the handkerchief, it had fluttered down like a wounded bird landing in the mud. He had picked it up. She had not seen. Or perhaps she had, and simply kept walking, trusting the world to be kinder than it was. Now the fabric sat in his pocket, damp and warm from his body heat, a secret he carried alongside the pawn ticket. Two secrets, one red, one yellowed, both evidence of things that should not exist. A bus roared past, splashing murky water onto the curb. Mix flinched, stepping back until his heel hit the edge of the gutter. The driver's gaze sliced straight through the scene, fixed on some distant point beyond the grime. No one looked. They were all blind or chose to be, shielding their eyes from the truth that festered behind the polite facades of Rillington Place. Christie had offered a cigarette. A neighbor had accepted. They had talked about the rain, about the grime. As if the world was nothing more than a dirty window needing a wipe. But some stains did not come out with scrubbing brushes. Some stains soaked into the wood, into the plaster, into the bones of the house itself. "Oi, watch it, mate!" The shout came from the shop doorway. A man in a stained apron stood there, wiping his hands on a rag that looked as grimy as the pavement. He glared at Mix, his face flushed with the heat of the boiler inside. "You planning to stand there all night, or are you coming in? I'm shutting up in 5. Mix blinked, the man's voice cutting through the fog in his brain. "Tobacco," he said. His voice sounded thin, reedy, unfamiliar to his own ears. "Players, please." The shopkeeper sighed, a long, rattling exhalation that smelled of stale tea and impatience. He stepped back, holding the door open just wide enough for Mix to squeeze through. "Hurry up then, got a train to catch." Mix entered. The warmth of the shop hit him, carrying the scent of roasted coffee, dried fruit, and the sharp, comforting smell of unburnt tobacco. It was a sensory overload, a clash against the cold reality he had just left outside. He moved to the counter, placing his coins on the glass surface. They clinked, a small, bright sound in the quiet room. The shopkeeper swept them into the till without counting them, his eyes fixed on the clock above the shelves. "Rough night," the man muttered, sliding the packet of players across the counter. "Rain plays havoc with the joints. My old missus says she can feel the storm coming before the clouds even gather. Says her knee tells her everything." "Does it?" Mix asked. He picked up the tobacco, the paper crinkling under his fingers. He needed to light it, needed the smoke to fill his lungs, to mask the smell of disinfectant that still clung to his memory. "Always does," the shopkeeper said. He leaned forward, lowering his voice as if sharing a state secret. "People think they're safe indoors, think the walls protect them, but the damp gets in, the rot gets in, you can't keep it out forever." He tapped the side of his nose. "Mark my words, something bad's brewing in this neighborhood. I can smell it." Mix froze. The packet of tobacco hovered halfway to his pocket. "Smell what?" The shopkeeper shrugged, straightening up and turning to switch off the main light. The shop plunged into semi-darkness, lit only by the street lamp outside casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. Nothing specific, just wrongness, like when a dog barks at nothing, or a door slams when there's no wind. He looked at Mix, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You live on Rillington, don't you? I see you walking, counting your steps, aren't you?" Mix's breath hitched. He had not realized anyone was watching. "Nothing wrong with routines," the man said, grabbing his cap from the hook behind the counter. "We all need something to hold on to when the world goes mad. But be careful, mate. Sometimes the things we count don't add up." He moved towards the door, ushering Mix out with a wave of his rag. "Lock your door tonight, and don't answer to anyone you don't know, especially if they're being polite." The door clicked shut behind Mix. The lock turned with a heavy, final sound. He stood on the pavement, the packet of tobacco clenched in his fist. The street was empty now. The bus had gone. The shopkeeper's words echoed in his head, mingling with the date on the pawn ticket. March 1949, stored, polite. A window slammed shut somewhere above him, the sound sharp as a gunshot. Mix looked up. The curtains at number 10 were drawn tight. No light leaked through the gaps. The house sat in the darkness like a held breath, waiting for someone to exhale. He put his hand in his pocket, his fingers closing around the red handkerchief. It felt soft, fragile, a piece of life in a place of death. He began to walk, not counting his steps this time, but listening. Listening for the sound of a baby crying, or a woman singing, or anything that proved the story he had been told was true. But there was only the wind, whistling through the cracks in the terrace, carrying the scent of rain and something else, something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long on a grave. He turned the corner, the shadow of number 10 stretching out behind him, reaching for his heels. Dust motes danced within the single shaft of afternoon light, cutting through the gap in Mix's curtains, swirling like tiny, panicked stars trapped within a jar. He held his breath, lungs burning with the need to exhale, yet he remained perfectly still. The gap was precise, 2 fingers' width, no more and no less, framed by the heavy velvet drapes his mother had sewn before the war took her lungs and left him the fabric along with a house full of silence. Through this slit, Rillington Place existed as a narrow strip of reality, a sliver of grey brick and wet pavement that he could measure, count, and ultimately control, even as the police vehicles below disrupted the order of the street with their chaotic presence. Number 10 stood opposite, its front door painted a glossy black that seemed to absorb the dull sky rather than reflect it, now taped off with yellow warning strips that fluttered in the chill autumn wind. Mix closed his eyes and the memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp. John Christie emerged in his mind's eye. He carried a broom, the bristles stiff and dark with use, orchestrating the dirt rather than simply sweeping it away. He started at the edge of the step, aligning the wooden handle of the broom with the vertical mortar line between the 3rd and 4th brick. Mix felt his own fingers twitch against the window ledge, mirroring the motion, a sympathetic tremor in the muscle that refused to settle. One stroke followed by another, then Christie paused, head tilted, inspecting the alignment of the dust pile he had created with the diligence of a surgeon. It was not enough to remove the grime. The grime had to be removed in the correct order, displaced to a location that satisfied some invisible geometric law known only to him. Madness, Mix whispered to the empty room, the word fogging the cold glass before he wiped it away with his thumb, leaving a clean circle through which to watch the ritual of memory. Christie wore his suit jacket despite the chill, the tweed rough and sensible, the color of dried leaves. He looked like a bank clerk, or perhaps a teacher of mathematics, a man whose life was governed by ledgers and sums that always balanced. There was no stain on his lapel. No smell of decay clung to him that Mix could detect from this distance, though the wind carried the usual Notting Hill perfume of wet coal smoke and rotting cabbage from the bins further down the lane. Christie swept the dust into a small, perfect mound before stopping to count the strokes while Mix counted with him, lips moving silently. 1, 2, 3, 12. Christie paused before the 13th stroke, standing still for a long moment with the broom hovering inches above the pavement, his gaze fixed on the front door of number 11 as if expecting someone to emerge. When no one came, he completed the 13th stroke, pushing the dust into the gutter where the rainwater gathered in oily slicks. 13, the number landed in Mix's stomach like a stone dropped down a well. A bicycle bell rang, sharp and brittle, cutting through the quiet street in the memory. A postman, young and freckled, wobbled to a halt at the curb. He swung a leg over the frame, his bag slapping against his hip with a dull thud. He walked up the path to number 10, holding a single envelope. The paper was thick, cream-colored, standing out violently against the grey day. Mix squinted. The address was typed in black ink, clear and formal. Mr. and Mrs. Evans, 10 Rillington Place. Mix's chest tightened, the air refusing to enter his lungs properly. The Evanses had gone. Everyone knew the Evanses had gone. Timothy to the police, Beryl to the grave, and the baby, Geraldine, to whatever limbo waited for children who died before they could walk. The flat was empty. The landlord had said so. The neighbors had nodded and looked at their shoes. Yet here was a letter, addressed to ghosts, delivered to a house that should have been silent. Christie stepped forward before the postman could knock. He opened the door just wide enough to slip his body into the threshold, blocking the view inside. Mick strained, pressing his nose against the cold glass until it ached, trying to see past the shoulder of the respectable neighbor, but the angle was wrong, the shadow too deep. "Post for the Evanses," the postman said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Must have got held up in the sorting office. You know how it is." "I do indeed," Christie replied. His voice was smooth, cultivated, lacking any regional edge that might place him as working class or poor. He extended a hand, pale and manicured. "Give them here. I'll ensure they receive them. They've asked me to manage their affairs while they're away." "Away," the postman repeated. He handed over the envelope. "Right you are, strange, isn't it, leaving post behind?" "Not strange at all," Christie said, taking the letter without looking at the name. He simply folded it once neatly and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Patting the fabric as if to secure a valuable coin, he added, "People are forgetful, especially in this weather, which only adds to the confusion." "Suppose it does." The postman touched his cap. "Afternoon, Mr. Christie." "Good day to you." Selection, Mix watched the window of number 10, needs to become something more descriptive without losing the meaning that he's looking at Christie's house. The previous sentence mentions the black door, so linking the window to that door or the house's appearance works well. Draft, Mix watched the dog. Mix turned from the window. The room suddenly felt too small, the air thick and stale. He needed to move. He needed to speak to someone who could confirm that he was not losing his mind. The hallway smelled of beeswax and boiled cabbage, a cloying sweetness that stuck to the back of the throat. Mix closed his door softly, latch clicking into place, and stood for a moment with his hand resting on the painted wood. 12 steps to the landing. He counted them twice before setting his foot on the first, testing the timber for give, for rot, for any sign that the structure might fail under the weight of a man who knew too much. The banister felt greasy under his palm, varnish worn away by the hands of dozens of tenants who had come and gone without leaving a trace. He moved downwards, skipping the 13th tread as he always did, hopping lightly to the 14th to avoid the bad luck that lived in the gap. Mrs. Gable lived in the front basement, where the light was always thin and green even at noon. Mix knocked 3 times, a rhythmic code he hoped she would recognize as urgent, and waited. The sound of knitting needles ceased inside. Footsteps shuffled across line, slow and deliberate. When the door opened, it revealed a woman wrapped in a cardigan the color of dried mustard, her hair pinned tight against her skull. She held a tea towel in one hand, wiping moisture from fingers that smelled of carbolic soap. "Mr. Cellini," she did not smile, "you're blocking the draft." "The Evanses," Mix said. The words came out too fast, tumbling over each other like stones down a chute. "The family at number 10, have you seen them?" Mrs. Gable stepped back into the room, expecting him to follow. He did not. She sighed, a sharp exhalation through her nose, and gestured for him to enter the small parlor where a fire crackled weakly in the grate. A cat slept on the hearthrug, one eye opening to slit a yellow gaze at the intruder before closing again against the warmth. "Mr. Christie handles the rents for that floor," she said, picking up her knitting from the side table. The needles were bone, clicking together with a sound like insect legs. "He's a helpful neighbor, very steady. During the blackout, he checked the windows for me when the sirens went." "They moved," Mix said. He stood by the door, unwilling to sit, unwilling to accept the tea she was already pouring from a brown pot into a chipped cup. 3 weeks ago, the van came, I saw it. Timothy found work in Merthyr. Mrs. Gable poured the tea. Steam rose in a thin column, vanishing into the gloom of the ceiling. "Mr. Christie told me himself, said they left in a hurry but all settled. You know how it is with young families, always rushing about." "And the post?" Mix asked. He could feel the sweat cooling on his neck, the shirt sticking to his skin despite the chill in the basement. "A letter came today, addressed to them, to the house." Mrs. Gable stopped knitting. The needles hovered in midair, suspended over the woolen sock she was mending. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw the calculation behind her eyes, the weighing of his sanity against the reputation of the man who paid the bills on time. "Post goes astray," she said finally. Her voice was flat, devoid of the warmth she had shown when speaking of Christie. "The sorting office is a shambles since the war. Everyone knows that. Mr. Christie said he would forward it. He is trustworthy, Mr. Cellini, unlike some who ask questions better left alone." She placed the cup on the table. The liquid sloshed over the rim, brown staining the wood. "He took the letter," Mick said, noting how he slipped it into his pocket without ever glancing at the name. "Then he is saving them the trouble of collecting it." Mrs. Gable picked up the needles again. The clicking resumed, faster this time, a rhythmic dismissal. "You should go back upstairs, Mr. Cellini. The damp down here plays tricks on the chest, makes people imagine things." "It wasn't imagination. Drink your tea." Mix looked at the cup. The surface of the liquid was still, reflecting the grey light from the window well above his feet. He thought of the letter in Christie's pocket, folded once, tucked away beside a handkerchief or a coin. He thought of the Evanses in Merthyr, alive and well, drinking tea in a house that did not smell of formaldehyde and wet brick. The story fit together perfectly, every piece locking into place, except for the one jagged edge that cut against his thumb. He turned away. The door closed behind him with a soft thud, cutting off the sound of the knitting needles. The climb back to his room felt longer than the descent. He counted the steps again, forcing himself to touch the 13th tread this time, pressing his shoe hard against the wood to prove it held no power, no magic that could harm him. It was just wood, just a number. But his heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. The hallway was empty. The house held its breath. Inside his room, the curtains were still parted. The light outside had faded to a dull twilight, the street lamps flickering on with a hiss of gas. Number 10 was dark. No light showed in the windows, yet Mix knew someone was there. He could feel the presence of the other man like a pressure change in the air, a drop in barometric reading before a storm. He sat on the edge of his bed. The springs groaned. Silence filled the space, heavy and thick, pressing against his eardrums until he wanted to shout just to break it. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. He clasped them together to still the tremor, interlocking the fingers until the knuckles turned white. The letter was inside the house. The Evanses were gone. Christie was alone. The equation did not balance. A sound drifted up through the floorboards. Scrape, pause, scrape. It was faint, rhythmic, the sound of metal against brick. Mick stopped breathing. He leaned forward, straining to catch the pattern, to fit it into a sequence he could understand. It came again, clearer this time, originating from the kitchen of the flat above. A trowel smoothing mortar, a wall being built, or perhaps sealed. He counted the intervals, 1, 2, 3. The scraping continued, steady and methodical, marking time in the dark. The sound tore through the floorboards, raw and gritty, like a knife dragged across a plate. Mix froze. His fingers dug into the wool of his trousers, pulling the fabric tight against his thigh until the fibers protested. Above him, in the kitchen of the flat directly overhead, something metal was biting into brick. It wasn't the clumsy thud of a pipe being fixed or the rattle of a loose sash chain catching in the wind. This was deliberate. A trowel loading mortar, smoothing it over a gap, sealing a breach with the slow, patient rhythm of a man who knows he has all the time in the world. He held his breath. The air in his room tasted of stale tobacco and the damp rot rising from the basement kitchen where Mrs. Gable kept her preserves. Scrape, pause, scrape. 13 seconds between strokes. Or was it 12? Mix tapped his thumb against his knee, trying to lock the interval into a count, to force the chaos of the noise into a grid he could understand. If it was 12, it meant nothing. If it was 13, it was a signal, a message drilled through the lath and plaster specifically for him. The difference mattered. The difference was everything. A car backfired on the street below, a sharp crack that made him flinch, his shoulders hiking up towards his ears as if expecting a blow. Nothing changed upstairs. The scraping continued, indifferent to the traffic, to the night, to the man sitting rigid on the edge of a sagging bed 3 floors down. It was the sound of construction, of repair, yet it carried the weight of burial. Mix knew that sound. He had heard it in his dreams, the sound of earth being packed down over a box that was too small, too light. He stood up, The floorboards creaked under his weight, a loud complaint in the stillness. Walking to the window felt like wading through treacle. His legs resisted, heavy with the knowledge that to look was to invite the thing outside to look back. He parted the curtains just a fraction, an inch of gap barely wide enough to admit the slit of orange light from the street lamp. The pavement below was wet, reflecting the glow in slick, distorted patches that looked like oil spills. No one walked there now. The respectable folks of this dead-end row were indoors, behind double-locked doors, pretending the world ended as neatly as their garden fences. Number 10 was dark. Not a single lamp burned in the front room, yet Mix knew Christie was there. The man moved through shadows the way other men moved through daylight, untroubled, unseen. He had taken the letter. He had signed for it with that flourished, looping script that looked too elegant for a simple neighborly favor. Forwarding, Mrs. Gable had called it, a polite word for theft, a polite word for erasure. The scrapings stopped. Sentence 1, silence rushed back into the room, heavy and suffocating, pressing against Mix's eardrums until they popped. Keep meaning, silence returns, heavy suffocating, pressure on eardrums, popping. 13. A new sound began, a soft, wet thud like a sack of flour dropped onto a wooden table. Then another came, rhythmic and heavy. Mix stepped back from the window, his heel catching on the rug. He stumbled, grabbing the windowsill to steady himself, his palms scraping against the rough paint. His heart was hammering now, a frantic bird beating its wings against the cage of his ribs, but he didn't dare clutch his chest. To touch the pain was to acknowledge it, and if he acknowledged it, the count would break. The pattern would shatter. He looked at his hand. It was trembling. Downstairs, the front door of the house opened and closed. Voices drifted up the well of the staircase, muffled but distinct. Mrs. Gable was seeing someone out. A tenant, a visitor. The cadence of her voice was different than it had been with Hema, warmer, lighter, stripped of the suspicion that had narrowed her eyes when he asked about the Evanses. "He's a good man, Mr. Christie," she had said, very steady. Steady, the word echoed in Mix's head, bouncing off the walls of his skull. Steady hands could hold a trowel. Steady hands could pack mortar into the gaps around a body wrapped in oilcloth. Steady hands could sign for post that never reached its destination. He moved away from the window, crossing the room to the door. The wood was cold under his fingertips. He wanted to go out there, to bang on Christie's door, to demand the letter, to scream the truth until the windows rattled in their frames. But what truth did he have? A count, a feeling, the word of a man who touched every 13th stair because he believed his sister's ghost waited there. They would lock him up. They would put him in a white room with padded walls and take away his pencils, his papers, his ability to count the days until the rain stopped. The wet thudding upstairs resumed, slower now, deliberate. Mix pressed his ear against the door of his own room. The wood was thin, vibrating slightly with the sounds from the floor above. He closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his lids, he saw the kitchen of number 10. He saw the alcove behind the cupboard, the one Christie had built last winter to store his coal. He saw the fresh mortar, still grey and wet. He saw the letter in Christie's pocket, the one addressed to Timothy Evans, care of Rillington Place. Merthyr, Mrs. Gable had said. They went to Merthyr. But the post didn't go to Merthyr. It came here. It came to a house that smelled of formaldehyde and wet brick, to a man who swept his path with military precision and smiled with a mouth that never reached his eyes. A floorboard creaked directly above Mix's head. Footsteps followed, heavy and deliberate, as they paced the length of the kitchen. Back and forth, they were measuring. Mix sank onto the bed. The springs groaned in protest. He clasped his hands together again, interlocking the fingers until the joints turned white, trying to hold himself together as the sounds of the grave drifted down through the ceiling. He needed a number. He needed a sequence, something to impose order on the rising tide of panic that threatened to drown him. He looked at the door. 13 minutes. That was how long the scraping had lasted. He was sure of it. He had counted every stroke, every pause, every breath he had held in the silence between. 13 minutes of work, 13 minutes to seal a wall, 13 minutes to hide a secret that would rot the floorboards beneath them all. The footsteps upstairs stopped. Silence returned, absolute and total. It was worse than the noise. The silence felt expectant, as if the house itself was waiting for him to make a move, to step out into the hallway, to climb the stairs and confront the man who stood at the top. Mix looked at his shoes. They were muddy from the street, leaving faint brown smears on the rug. He should clean them. He should follow the ritual, scrape the soles, brush the laces, place them by the door in perfect alignment. Order, control, safety. But he couldn't move. His legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot by a fear that went deeper than superstition. This wasn't about the number 13 anymore. This was about the man in the dark kitchen, the man who had taken the letter and the family and the truth and packed them away behind a wall of fresh mortar. A draft slipped under the door, carrying a scent that made Mix's stomach turn. It was faint, barely perceptible beneath the smell of coal dust and old wood, but it was there, sweet, cloying. The smell of flowers left too long in a vase, turning to slime. He gagged, covering his mouth with his hand. Upstairs, a match struck. The flare of light briefly illuminated the gap under his door, a thin orange line that cut across the floorboards before vanishing. Christie was lighting his pipe, sitting in the dark, smoking, listening to the silence he had created. Mix waited. He counted his breaths. 1, 2, 3. He would not sleep tonight. He would sit here in the dark and listen to the house breathe. He would wait for the next sound, the next mistake, the next crack in the mask of respectability that covered the face of evil. And tomorrow, he would watch Gwyneth walk past the door. He would make sure she didn't stop. He would make sure she didn't look up at the window where the light had just gone out. The scent of sweet rot grew stronger, seeping into the room, filling his lungs. Mix closed his eyes. He began to count again. The damp worked through the sole of her left shoe, a cold seep that climbed the arch and settled in the ankle bone like a bruise. Gwyneth Price adjusted the strap of her satchel, feeling the leather bite into her shoulder, and kept her eyes fixed on the patch of pavement 3 yards ahead. Notting Hill wore its wetness heavily this November morning, the sky a low, bruised ceiling that pressed down on the chimneys and turned the brickwork black. She walked with the rhythm of habit, heel-toe, a metronome against the slur of traffic on the Uxbridge Road, but her skin prickled, aware of a gaze that had no source she could name. It sat on her neck, heavy and warm, distinct from the chill air. Number 10 Rillington Place lay just past the alley mouth, its front door painted a sensible cream that already looked grey in the half-light. The curtains in the downstairs window were drawn, thick velvet, blocking any view of the interior, yet the sensation of being watched did not fade as she passed. It followed her, a physical weight between her shoulder blades, until she cleared the corner and the line of sight broke. She stopped. A stone had lodged in the groove of her shoe, sharp and irritating. Gwyneth leaned against the rough brick of the wall, lifting her foot to undo the buckle, and that was when the black-painted door with the brass numeral 10 swung open. John Christie stepped out, holding a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. He wore his suit, the grey flannel impeccable despite the moisture in the air, and his glasses caught the dull light. He saw her immediately. A smile formed on his face, polite and practiced, the kind of expression a man uses to disarm a nervous neighbor. "Miss Price," he said. His voice was soft, lacking any edge, floating across the narrow gap between the properties. "You'll catch your death out here without a proper coat." Gwyneth straightened, leaving the shoe unbuckled. "I'm quite warm, Mr. Christie, thank you." He took a step towards her, extending the parcel as if offering a gift, though his hands remained tucked close to his body. "I was just posting this for my wife. Heavy thing. Perhaps you'd like me to carry your satchel to the corner. The ground is slippery." No, the word came out sharper than she intended. She softened it with a tight smile that pulled at the corners of her mouth. "I manage, really." Christie paused. He did not retreat immediately but stood for a second, his head tilted slightly, studying her with an interest that felt clinical rather than neighborly. Then he nodded, a small, precise movement, and stepped back onto his own threshold. "Of course, one must be independent. It's a virtue." He closed the door. The latch clicked, a solid, final sound that echoed in the quiet street. Gwyneth finished buckling her shoe, her fingers trembling slightly, and walked on. The casting agency was located in a converted townhouse near the station, a place of high ceilings and dusty mirrors where young women stood in lines and waited to be told they were not quite right. Inside, the air smelled of stale tobacco and face powder. Mr. Henderson, the director, sat behind a desk cluttered with headshots, tapping a pencil against his teeth. He looked up as she entered, his eyes scanning her from head to toe without seeing her. Again, he said, he didn't ask her to speak, he commanded it. Gwyneth moved to the marked spot on the floorboards and recited the lines she had prepared, a monologue about a girl waiting for a train. She put emotion into it, trying to summon a sense of longing, of urgency. When she finished, the room was silent. Henderson stopped tapping the pencil. He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight, and sighed. "You disappear, Gwyneth," he said. His tone was not unkind, merely factual. "On the screen you blend, it's the complexion, the hair, you blend into the background like smoke. We need color, we need presence. You look like you're already half gone." The words landed in her stomach, cold and heavy. She gathered her things, muttering a thank you that he didn't hear, and left the building. Outside, the rain had started again, a fine mist that coated her hair and made the world look blurred. She began the walk home, but at the junction near the alley behind Rillington Place, she stopped. Her usual route took her past the rear entrance, a narrow path where the dustbins were kept, but today the air there seemed still, unnaturally so. No pigeons picked at the refuse, no cats prowled the walls. The silence was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the sound from her footsteps. She turned left instead, taking the long way around the block. The detour added 10 minutes to her journey, forcing her to walk along the main road where the buses roared and the people jostled, but the fear in her chest did not recede. It sat there, a hard knot beneath her ribs, tightening with every step closer to her own door. When she finally reached her building, a terraced house 2 streets over from the horror of number 10, she fumbled for her key. The brass felt cold in her hand. She pushed the door open and stepped into the hallway. Something lay on the doormat. It was red, a splash of vibrant, impossible color against the dull brown of the coir. Gwyneth froze, her breath catching in her throat. She knew that scrap of fabric. It was her handkerchief, the one with the small tear in the hem that she had lost 3 days ago near the gardens. She had retraced her steps, asked the neighbors, assumed it was gone forever in the mud. Now it sat on her threshold, folded into a perfect square, the edges aligned with mathematical precision. She crouched, her heart hammering against her ribs, and reached for it. Her fingers brushed the linen. It was dry, despite the rain, and stiff. She lifted it to her nose, the movement instinctive, driven by a need to understand how it had arrived there. The scent hit her instantly, cutting through the smell of the damp hallway. It did not smell of the gardens, or of dirt, or of the tobacco smoke that clung to most things in this part of London. It smelled of chemicals, sharp, sweet, cloying. Formaldehyde, and beneath it, the faint, acrid tang of strong tobacco, the specific blend Christie packed into his pipe. Gwyneth dropped the handkerchief as if it burned. It landed on the floor, the red fabric looking like a wound against the wood. She scrambled back, her heels slipping on the polish, and pressed herself against the wall. The hallway was empty. The street outside was quiet, but the air in the room felt displaced, charged with the presence of someone who had just left, someone who had stood here, folded the cloth, and waited for her to find it. She looked at the front door. It was locked. She had locked it herself, yet the handkerchief was inside. A floorboard creaked in the room above her. Gwyneth stared at the ceiling, her blood turning to ice. She was not alone in the house. The pavement gleamed with a slick of oil, reflecting the bruised sky hanging over Notting Hall, where Gwyneth kept her head low, collar turned up against the damp, though the sensation of eyes pressing against the nape of her neck refused to fade entirely. It sat upon her like a physical mass, heavy and persistent, originating from the shadowed moor of the narrow alleyway, yet she did not look back, because looking back invariably invited things in. Instead, she counted their steps, a childish habit resurrected by the tension coiling in her shoulders, marking 1, 2, 3 until the cadence broke, when the strap of her left shoe snagged upon an uneven flagstone. The leather gave way with a sharp report, causing her to stumble and catch herself against the rough brickwork of the terrace wall, where mortar crumbled beneath her palm, dusty and cold to the touch. The buckle hung loose, the brass tongue dangling like a dead worm, forcing her to curse softly under her breath as she shifted her balance to the curb and crouched low. The position felt dangerously vulnerable, exposing the pale line of her throat to the empty street while her fingers fumbled with the metal clasp, stiffened by the chill, yet the mechanism remained stubbornly jammed. Iron oxide gritted between the teeth of the buckle so that when pressed harder, nothing yielded to her touch. A shadow fell across her knuckles, causing Gwyneth to freeze in place before she even saw the man casting the darkness. Slowly, she lifted her gaze until she found John Christie standing upon the edge of the pavement, the brim of his hat dripping a steady, rhythmic moisture onto the collar of his mackintosh. Under one arm, he held a parcel wrapped in plain brown paper, his expression mild and composed, the face of a neighbor from whom one might borrow sugar, yet his eyes remained still and unblinkingly affixed upon her with an intensity that felt utterly clinical. Trouble. His voice emerged soft and cultivated, lacking the rough, guttural edges of the market traders working down the road. Just the shoe, Gwyneth replied, straightening her spine though she did not fully rise, keeping one hand pressed against the wall for balance as she admitted the strap was caught. Christie stepped closer without entering her personal space, yet the proximity brought his scent with it, which was distinct from the smell of rain or wet wool that clung to most men in such weather. It was sharper, chemical and sweet like lilies left too long within a warm room, underpinned by the acrid, lingering tang of strong tobacco that lodged immediately in the back of her throat. "Allow me," he suggested, shifting the parcel to his left hand so he might extend the right, his gloves grey and perfectly spotless, claiming a natural knack with stubborn things because buckles responded to the same pressure as mechanics. No, the word escaped sharper than she had intended, softened only by a tight, polite smile that pulled at the corners of her mouth, while she insisted she could manage. Christie paused in his retreat, standing for a long second with his head tilted slightly to one side, studying her with an interest that felt entirely devoid of human warmth before nodding a small and precise movement, and stepping back towards his own threshold. The brown paper package shifted beneath his arm, rustling dryly, as he remarked that a woman must be independent, calling it a virtue, while his gaze dropped briefly to her broken shoe, then lifted to her face, lingering uncomfortably on her mouth. "But do be careful," he warned softly, noting the ground was slippery, and that accidents happened so easily whenever one became distracted, before turning slowly towards the door of number 10. The key slid into the lock with a smoothly oiled silence that suggested frequent, practiced use, and he offered no backward glance as he pushed the door open to reveal an interior hallway that was dark, a void completely swallowed by the shadows within. For a fleeting second, Gwyneth believed she saw movement inside the gloom, perhaps a shift of fabric or merely the trick of light dancing on dust motes, but then the heavy door closed with a click of the latch, a solid and final sound that echoed distinctly in the quiet street. She exhaled sharply, a cloud of white vapor dissolving into the damp air, her hands trembling as she finally forced the stubborn buckle shut until the metal bit hard into her thumb. The pressure drew a bead of blood that welled up slowly, bright against her pale skin, which she wiped hastily upon her stocking, leaving a smudge of rust-colored stain that looked remarkably like dirt. Rising to her full height, she swept her gaze across the windows of the terrace row, where curtains remained tightly drawn and faces stayed hidden, leaving the street entirely to her and the man who had vanished behind the black paint of number 10. She resumed walking, though the rhythm of her steps remained broken, every sound, the persistent drip of water from a rusted drainpipe, the distant rumble of the number 28 bus on the main thoroughfare, making her flinch visibly. The scent of lilies and stale tobacco trailed behind her, invisible yet suffocating, clinging tenaciously to the damp fabric of her coat while she passed the narrow alleyway that cut sharply between the houses. Usually, stray cats prowled within that space, scavenging for discarded fish guts or milk scraps, but today the entrance stood empty, devoid of any movement or living sound. Even the pigeons avoided gathering on the chimney pots above, circling wide, as if an unseen current repelled them, leaving the air at the alley mouth perfectly still, heavier than the rest of the street, holding a silence that felt expectant and waiting. Gwyneth crossed the road to avoid passing the rear entrance directly, her shoes clicking loudly on the wet stones, the sound too pronounced in the absence of other life. She told herself it was merely the weather, that the relentless rain drove people indoors, and the cold kept the animals hidden, but the knot beneath her ribs tightened painfully, pulling against her breath. She thought constantly of the way Christie had looked at her hands, ignoring her face and eyes, focusing solely on her hands as if measuring them for a specific size. The casting agency sat near the station, a converted terraced house with peeling paint and a brass nameplate that had long lost its shiny, where Gwyn the half-eth paused momentarily at the iron gate. She checked her reflection in a darkened windowy, smoothing her wind-blown hair, wiping the smudge of blood from her thumbie, and noting the grey of her coat matched the sky, the pavement, and the dull brick of the buildings surrounding her completely. She looked like part of the scenery, a mere smudge of charcoal on a page already full of printed text. She pushed the gate open, the hinge screaming a high, thin note that shattered the quiet atmosphere. Inside, the hallway smelled strongly of stale tobacco and face powder, a cloying mixture that masked the underlying scent of damp plaster, where Mr. Henderson sat behind a desk cluttered with headshots, tapping a pencil against the wooden blotter while he waited. Henderson tapped the pencil. The sound was a dry insect clicking against woody, a repetitive and irritating, drilling into the space between ears until she wanted to swipe the blotcher clean just to make it stop. Zed. She lowered herself into the chair, the leather cracking under the shift of weight, and folded her hands in her lap to hide the thumb where the blood had already dried to a brown scab. Henderson let his gaze skip past her face, tracking instead the line of her coat, the scuff on her shoe, the way the damp hem clung to her ankle like a second skin, assessing value in inches of wool and thread. He leaned back, the wood groaning in protest, and picked up a photograph from the cluttered pile, holding it against the dull light filtering through the dirty window pane. "You disappear, Miss Price." The words landed flat, devoid of malice, yet carrying a finality that made her stomach tighten. He turned the photograph over, face down, and slid it beneath a paperweight shaped like a globe dog that had lost its tail. "The screen eats grey," Henderson continued, waving a hand towards the window where the sky hung low and bruised over the rooftops of Notting Hill. "Camera film is sensitive to light, not to shadow, and you are wearing the weather itself. A girl needs color, rouge, a hat with a feather, something that says I am here, I am alive, do not look past me." Gwyneth touched her cheek. The skin felt cool, waxy, as if the blood had retreated deep inside to protect the vital organs from the cold. "I have a red scarf," she said, the voice sounding thin in the small room. "Then wear it." He reached for the pencil again, resuming the tapping rhythm that marked the end of the audience. "Next week, Tuesday, do not be late." She stood, the dismissal was absolute, a physical push towards the door. In the hallway, the scent of face powder was thicker now, cloying and sweet like rotting lilies, mixing with the ash from Henderson's pipe, which hung in blue ribbons near the ceiling. She pushed open the front gate, the hinge screaming that high thin note again, and stepped out onto the pavement where the rain had slowed to a mist that coated the eyelashes. Tuesday, 7 days to find a color in a world draining itself of hue. She walked west, away from the station, but stopped at the corner of Rillington Place. The usual route home took her past the alley behind number 10, a shortcut she had used since moving to the lodging house last month, but today her feet refused the turn. The alley mouth yawned dark between the brick walls, empty of the stray cats that usually fought over fish heads near the bins. Even the pigeons avoided the chimney pots above, circling wide as if an unseen current repelled them, leaving the air at the alley mouth perfectly still, heavier than the rest of the street. Gwyneth crossed the road to avoid the rear entrance directly, her shoes clicking loudly on the wet stones, the sound too pronounced in the absence of other life. A bus rumbled past on the main thoroughfare, exhaust fumes mixing with the damp wool of her coat, and she pulled the collar tight against her throat. It was merely the weather, she told herself, that the relentless rain drove people indoors and the cold kept the animals hidden, but the knot beneath her ribs tightened painfully, pulling against breath. She thought constantly of the way Christie had looked at her hands earlier, ignoring her face and eyes, focusing solely on the fingers as if measuring them for a specific size or a pair of gloves. The detour added 10 minutes to the walk, looping around the back of the gasworks where the iron fences were rusted through and the ground smelled of sulfur. She counted the steps unconsciously, 1, 2, 3, matching the rhythm of her heartbeat, until she realized what she was doing and stopped, forcing herself to walk without pattern. Superstition was for people like Mick Cellini downstairs, the man who counted raindrops and avoided the 13th tread, not for working girls who needed to get home and boil water for tea. Her building came into view, a tired terrace house with peeling paint and a front door that stuck in the frame during winter. She climbed the 3 steps to the entrance, key already in hand, but froze before inserting it into the lock. Something lay on the doormat. Red. A stark, violent shock of color against the brown coir fiber. She crouched, the knees cracking, and reached out a gloved hand to touch the fabric. It was her handkerchief, the red one she had lost 3 days ago, convinced she had dropped it near the market stall on Portobello Road. She had mourned the loss, not for the value of the cloth, but for the brightness of it, the only thing she owned that refused to blend into the grey. Now it sat folded neatly, corners aligned with geometric precision, exactly as Christie folded his own letters in the hallway downstairs. Gwyneth picked it up. The linen was dry despite the heavy mist clinging to the courtyard stones, suggesting it had not been there long, placed only moments before her arrival. She brought it closer to her face, instinct overriding caution, and inhaled. The scent of lavender water she used to wash it was gone, buried under something sharper, chemical and sweet like lilies, left too long within a warm room, underpinned by the acrid, lingering tang of strong tobacco that lodged immediately in the back of her throat. Her hand shook, the red cloth fluttered in the breeze, a signal flag waved from a sinking ship. She looked up and down the street, searching the windows of the opposite terrace, where curtains remained tightly drawn and faces stayed hidden, but the row of houses offered no witness, no movement, only the blank stare of glass panes reflecting the street back at itself. Someone had been here. Someone had watched her leave, watched the time pass, and placed this object here to mark the spot where she lived. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, the darkness of the hallway swallowing her whole. The smell of the house was different now, the usual scent of boiled cabbage and wet dog overlaid with that faint, cloying sweetness that clung to the handkerchief in her fist. She climbed the stairs to her room, avoiding the 13th step out of a sudden, irrational habit, and closed the door behind her. Leaning against the wood, she unfolded the cloth on the dressing table where the mirror was spotted with age. In the reflection, her face looked pale, almost translucent, the grey of the street having seeped into her pores while she walked. But the handkerchief on the table burned bright, a wound on the white wood. She touched the fabric again, tracing the fold lines. They were crisp, exact. A knock came at the door. 3 sharp raps, perfectly spaced. Gwyneth did not move. The knock came again, louder this time, demanding acknowledgement from the person inside who was holding their breath. When the pencil snapped, black graphite dusted the page like a small, dark starburst, ruining the column of figures Mix had spent 3 hours aligning with obsessive care. He stared at the break, thumb rubbing the splintered wood, while waiting for the bad luck to land, yet none came save for the drip of a tap somewhere in the pipes, a rhythmic, mocking metronome counting seconds he could not afford to waste. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the windowpane streaked with grime that blurred the view of the narrow terrace into a watercolor smear of grey brick and wet slate. Mix wiped his hands on his trousers, leaving smudges of lead on the fabric, and leaned closer to the journal where the numbers swam before his eyes, dancing a jig that refused to settle into sense. Tuesday the 3rd, Christie had been seen at the chemist. Thursday the 5th, Mrs. Evans last seen carrying the pram. Saturday the 7th, purchase of 2 sacks of cement. He traced the line with a trembling finger, the ink still wet where he had added the latest entry to the jagged pattern cutting through the mundane record of a London section airing currency copyright, yet it held a terrible symmetry. Every time the column of purchases rose, a name vanished from the neighborhood roll call, erased as cleanly as a chalk mark from a school board. For coincidence did not smell of lime and damp earth, nor stack its evidence in neat, geometric piles behind a garden shed. Mix turned the page, the paper crackling loud in the quiet room, needing to see the whole arc and the entire shape of the beast before he could name it. His breath hitched, a sharp intake that tasted of stale tea and fear, wondering if he could lay this book on the desk of the detective standing guard outside number 10, so the man in the rain-slicked coat would have to listen. They dealt in facts, the police, capturing dates and times and movements, so this was nothing but movement pinned like a butterfly in a glass case. He closed the journal, sliding it into the inside pocket of his jacket where it sat heavy against his ribs, a second heart beating a frantic, irregular rhythm. Downstairs, the front door opened and closed with a soft click, followed by footsteps ascending the stairs, heavy and deliberate, pausing on the 12th tread before skipping the 13th to land on the 14th. Mix knew that gate was not the landlady's but the officer's, come to check the locks again and ensure the respectable tenant at number 10 remained undisturbed by the likes of him. Mix grabbed his cap, shoving it onto his head without checking the mirror, for he could not stay here tracing lines on paper while the truth rotted in the garden next door. Static burned in his bones, demanding movement rather than the tracing of lines, so he slipped into the hallway, pressing his back against the cold plaster wall as the policeman's shadow stretched across the floorboards below. The man hummed a tuneless fragment of a music hall song, a sound of bored authority that grated on Mix's nerves like sandpaper on raw skin, and when the front door slammed, signaling the officer's return to his post on the pavement, Mix moved. The air outside was thick, clinging to his skin like a layer of oily film as he crossed the narrow gap between the houses, his shoes sinking slightly into the mud that coated the yard. The police cordon tape fluttered in the draft, a lazy barrier that assumed the threat was contained within the brickwork, never suspecting the danger might be buried in the soil. Mix ducked under the tape, the plastic catching on his shoulder with a sticky tear, approaching the shed at the rear, a rotting wooden structure that leaned precariously towards the fence. The padlock hung open, hasp swinging free, whether a mistake or an invitation, so he pushed the door until it groaned on rusted hinges, revealing a darkness that smelled sharply of ammonia and something sweetly decayed, like fruit left too long in the sun. Mix struck a match, the flare illuminating the interior in a sudden, harsh glow to reveal dozens of sacks stacked against the far wall, faded labels warning of quicklime clear enough in the flickering light. He stepped forward, his foot crunching on something granular scattered across the dirt floor, not dirt but powder, white and fine as bone meal. He crouched, dipping a finger into the pile where the powder clung to his skin, instantly dry, pulling the moisture from his fingerprint until the ridge patterns felt tight and strange. He brought his hand to his nose, the scent hitting him with the force of a physical blow, acrid and burning, stripping the lining of his throat. For this was not for cleaning but for dissolving, for making flesh into fluid, for turning a woman into nothing but a stain on the earth. A twig snapped outside, freezing Mix with the match burning down to his fingertips, so he dropped it, stamping out the flare in the white dust, and scrambled backward into the shadows of the shed. Voices drifted over the fence, low and indistinct, not the policeman but someone else, closer, so he held his breath, lungs burning, waiting for the door to swing open and the face of the respectable neighbor to appear in the gap, smiling that polite, empty smile. But the voices passed, fading towards the street, and Mix waited another 10 counts, then 20, forcing his legs to move only when the numbness threatened to lock them in place. He slipped out of the shed, wiping his hand frantically on his trousers, but the white stain remained, a ghost mark on the dark wool. The run back to his room was a blur of splashed puddles and ragged breathing, bursting through his door, slamming it shut and leaning against it, his heart hammering against the journal in his pocket, safe for now. He pulled the book out, needing to add the discovery, to seal the proof in ink before it could be denied, and flipped to the section marked Evans, the pages dog-eared from constant reference. His hands stopped, for the pages were gone, not torn roughly, but removed with a surgeon's precision that suggested the monster knew exactly where to cut. The match hissed out, surrendering Thesh to a darkness that rushed in thick and suffocations, smelling of wet wood and that sweet, cloying rot of fruit forgotten in a cupboard until it turns to black sludge. Mix stood frozen, knees bent, one hand still raised as if to ward off a blow that never landed, whilst the voices outside drifted closer, muffled by the thin partition of the fence. It was a low murmur of male conversation that lacked the bored drawl of the policeman on the corner, for these tones were sharper, clipped, carrying the precise enunciation of a man who corrected forms and tutted at spelling errors in the Morning Post. Christie was not in the house, but here, in the garden, perhaps 10 feet away, separated only by rotting planks and the shadow Mix now inhabited. The white powder on his fingertips began to itch, a dry, crawling sensation that felt less like a chemical burn and more like something alive, burrowing into the whorls of his skin to nestle in the bone. He wiped his hand on his trousers again, harder this time, rubbing the wool until it frayed, yet the stain glowed faint in the gloom, a phosphorescent mark of guilt. He counted to 10, forcing himself to stand still, to become part of the stack of sacks, to let the dust settle on his coat so he might blend into the architecture of death. When the count reached 20, the footsteps crunched on the gravel path outside the shed door, pausing directly before the gap where the hinges groaned. Mix held his breath until his lungs burned, a sharp, acidic fire that demanded release, yet he clamped his jaw shut, teeth grinding together until the muscles in his neck corded tight. The handle refused to turn, nor did the open to reveal the garden, for instead a shadow slid beneath the threshold, a dark tongue licking across the dirt floor, stopping inches from his shoe. Then the footsteps receded, fading towards the street, swallowed by the ambient hum of traffic and the distant wail of a siren that belonged to a world where laws still held sway. Mix waited another minute, then 2, counting the seconds in groups of 3, a nervous tick that offered no protection but kept the panic at bay. When he finally moved, his legs felt heavy, filled with lead shot, and he stumbled out into the yard, gasping in the damp air that suddenly smelled clean compared to the ammonia choke of the shed. The cordon tape fluttered above him, a lazy, mocking barrier that had failed to keep the monster in or the truth out. He ran, not in a dignified jog, but a desperate, flailing sprint across the mud, his shoes slipping, sending clods of earth flying against the brickwork of number 11. He did not look back, for he could not bear the sight. The image of those stacked sacks, 13 piles of pure dissolution, burned behind his eyelids, a geometric horror that validated every superstitious fear he had ever nursed. Up the steps of his own building, taking them 2 at a time, skipping the 12th, stumbling on the 13th before hurling himself onto the 14th. The hallway was empty, the landlady's door shut tight, the silence of the house pressing against his ears like cotton wool. He burst into his room, slamming the door until the frame shuddered, and leaned his back against it, sliding down until he hit the floor. He was safe, or so it seemed for now. The journal in his pocket felt heavy, a brick of evidence that could bring the whole rotten structure down. He pulled it out, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the leather-bound book onto the floorboards. He needed to write it down, specifically the date, the time, the smell, and the 13 piles. Ink would make it real, would anchor the hallucination of the last hour into the solid ground of fact. He flipped the cover open, the pages rustling like dry leaves, and turned to the section marked Evans. His finger traced the dog-eared corner, the place where he had logged Timothy's departure, the date Beryl vanished, the baby's cry that had stopped too soon. The page was blank, not empty of writing, but gone, removed entirely. A clean, rectangular void where the paper had been sliced away with a razor's precision, leaving only the rough stubs of the binding thread. Mix stared at the gap, his mind refusing to process the impossibility of it, for he had not left this room since the policeman's visit. The landlady had a key, yes, but she was a woman of habit who never entered without knocking, who feared the chaos of a tenant's private affairs. Only one person moved with that kind of silent, surgical efficiency. Only one person knew exactly which words posed the threat. Mix ran his thumb over the jagged edge of the remaining paper, feeling the rough bite of the cut against his skin. It did not bleed, but the sting was sharp, a reminder that the boundary between observer and observed had dissolved. Christie was not just hiding bodies, he was editing the narrative, pruning the evidence before the harvest could begin. Mix looked down at his hand, at the white dust still clinging to his fingerprint, glowing faintly in the dim light of the room. He was marked, the ledger was broken, and the man next door was already inside the story, rewriting the ending before Mix could even finish the sentence. A floorboard creaked in the hallway, distinct and deliberate, pausing exactly outside his door. The floorboard outside did not creak again. Still silence, thick and deliberate, pressed against the wood like a palm. Mix stopped breathing, his chest locked rigid, waiting for the turn of a handle, the scrape of a boot, the intrusion of a world that had already slipped its leash. Nothing. The silence stretched, taut as a wire, until the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of grey light from the window seemed to freeze midair, suspended in the amber of his terror. He waited for the count of 13, then 20, then 100, his mind racing through primes to keep the panic from flooding the room, but the hallway remained empty, a void where a man had just stood. Slowly, agonizingly, he uncurled from the floor, his joints popping with the dry crack of kindling, and crawled towards the bed. The journal lay open on the quilt, the torn pages gaping like a mouth stripped of lips. He reached out, his fingers trembling so violently they brushed the paper without touching it, afraid that contact might dissolve the remaining stubs into ash. The cut was clean, surgical. A razor had passed through the binding thread, and the heavy stock, with a single, confident stroke, removing not just the dates of the Evans' disappearance, but the sketches he had made of Christie's boots, the notes on the smell of boiling cabbage that masked the sweeter, rotting scent beneath. Someone had been here, not the landlady, Mrs. Gable, whose heavy tread shook the plaster and who announced her entry with a cough that sounded like a dying engine. This was a ghost, a man who moved without displacing air, who knew exactly which words threatened the architecture of his respectability. Mix pressed his thumb against the jagged edge of the stub, feeling the rough bite of the cellulose. It strung, a sharp, bright pain that grounded him, proving he was still flesh, and not yet a memory edited out of the narrative. He stood pacing the small room, 3 steps to the window, turn, 3 steps to the door, turn, a ritual that usually calmed the fracturing of his mind, but now only amplified the chaos. The white dust on his fingertips, the quicklime from the shed, had dried into a chalky crust that flaked onto the dark wood of the dresser. He rubbed at it, scrubbing with the nail of his index finger until the skin beneath turned raw and pink, but the stains seemed embedded in the whorls of his print, a mark of Cain applied not by God, but by a neighbor who balanced his checkbook on Fridays. 13 piles, he had counted them, 13 sacks of quicklime stacked in the shadows of the garden shed, a geometric confession hidden behind rotting planks and police tape. The number sang in his head, a high, thin note that drowned out the traffic on the Harrow Road. 13 was the number of guests at the Last Supper before the betrayal, the number of steps to the gallows, if one counted the landing, the number of times Christie had nodded to him in the hallway while carrying parcels wrapped in brown paper that bulged with the weight of limbs. Mick stopped at the window, peering through the gap in the curtains. The street below was unchanged. A bus rumbled past, spewing diesel smoke that mingled with the low-hanging fog. A woman in a red coat walked a terrier, the bright splash of color violently out of place against the grey pavement. Gwyneth. No, not Gwyneth, just a woman who looked like her from this height, a trick of the light and the desperate hope that innocence still walked free. He swept his gaze across the front of the house directly opposite. The curtains were drawn, tight and impenetrable, hiding the parlor where Christie sat, perhaps sharpening a knife, perhaps reviewing the ledger of his own, checking off the names of those who knew too much. The realization hit him not as a thunderclap, but as a slow, cold seepage, like water rising in a cellar. Christie knew. The man next door knew about the journal, about the counting, about the nights Mick spent pressing his ear to the shared wall to listen for the footsteps of the dead. The intrusion into his room was not a search, it was a message. A correction. I am the author here, the torn pages said. You are merely the paper I write upon. A knock at the door shattered the stillness. Mick jumped, his shoulder slamming into the window frame, pain flaring up his arm. He stared at the door, his heart hammering against his ribs like a bird trapped in a cage, wings beating against the bone. Mr. Cellini, the voice was muffled, polite, unmistakably Christie's. I believe you dropped this in the hall, earlier when you came in. Mick opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His throat had sealed shut, the muscles spasming in a primal refusal to engage. He looked at the journal, then at the door, then at his hands, still dusted with the white residue of the grave. Mr. Cellini, the handle turned slowly, the latch clicking with a sound of finality. Are you quite well? You look rather pale. One might think you'd seen a ghost. The door opened a crack. Christie's face appeared in the gap, framed by the dim light of the hallway. He wore his usual suit, grey and immaculate, the tie knotted with precise symmetry. His glasses caught the light, obscuring his eyes, turning them into blank, reflective discs that gave nothing away. He smiled, a small, courteous tightening of the lips that did not reach the rest of his face. I was just... Mix's voice was a rasp, dry and unused. He cleared his throat, trying to sweep the fear into a corner where it might be ignored. Writing in my journal. Ah yes, the journal. Christie stepped into the room without invitation, his movements smooth, fluid, as if he were flowing rather than walking. He closed the door behind him with a soft click that echoed like a gunshot in the small space. A dangerous habit, recording too much. One finds that memories are often more reliable when left to fade, don't you agree? Details become distorted, colors bleed, and suddenly one is certain of things that never happened at all. He moved to the bed, looking down at the open ledger. His expression did not change, no flicker of surprise or guilt, only a mild, academic interest, like a teacher reviewing a pupil's flawed sums. He reached out, his hand hovering over the torn pages. "Missing something, are we?" Christie asked, his tone light and conversational. "The Evans family, I believe, such a tragedy. Poor Timothy, poor Beryl, and the little one. It weighs on the mind, does it not, to carry such sorrow alone?" Mix backed away until his legs hit the edge of the washstand, the cold porcelain biting into his thighs. "You took them. You came into my room." "Rooms are not fortresses, Mr. Cellini, not in a house like this. The walls are thin, the locks are simple, and secrets have a way of leaking out like gas from a main." Christie turned from the bed, facing him fully now. The polite mask slipped just for a second, revealing the cold, hard machinery beneath, the utter lack of humanity that allowed a man to stack 13 piles of lime and sleep soundly in the bed above. "You count things, don't you? Steps, drops of rain, names." It must be exhausting, trying to impose order on a world that is fundamentally chaotic, but numbers cannot save you, they cannot bring them back, and they certainly cannot stop what is already done. He took a step forward. Mix flinched, raising his hands as if to ward off a blow, the white dust puffing from his fingers into the air between them, a small cloud of evidence hanging in the grey light. Christie looked at the dust, then at Mix's face. He smiled again, wider this time, showing teeth that were too white, too perfect. "Wash your hands, Mr. Cellini," he said softly. "You've got something on them, something that doesn't come off easily." He turned and walked to the door, opening it with the same silent efficiency he had used to enter. At the threshold, he paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Do try to rest. You look terrible. We wouldn't want you to become another statistic, would we? The neighborhood has had quite enough of those lately." The door closed. The lock did not turn, but the barrier was absolute. Mick stood alone in the center of the room, the white dust settling on his tongue, tasting of lime and old bones, while the silence of the house waited for him to make his next move, the next number in a sequence he no longer controlled. Scrape, wood dragged over stone, a rough, grating sound that cut through the damp air like a saw. Mick Cellini stood at his window, palms flat against the cold glass, watching the grey swirl outside where fog had swallowed Notting Hill whole, turning the street into a tunnel of woolly nothingness in which gas lamps burned with sickly choked halos. He counted the scrapes. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm matched the pulse in his wrists, a frantic drumming that had no business keeping time with a stranger's labor. Below, the pavement gleamed wet and black. A shape emerged from the mist, solid and dark against the pale void. Christie. He moved with that peculiar, fluid grace of his, shoulders square, head level, carrying a trunk that looked too heavy for one man. Leather straps hung loose, flapping against the sides with every step. Mix leaned closer, breath fogging the pain, wiping it away with a sleeve that smelled of stale tobacco and dust. "Heavy tonight, Mr. Cellini." The voice came from below, clear despite the distance. Mix flinched, knocking his elbow against the frame. Christie had stopped. He stood directly under the lamp, looking up, face tilted into the gloom. How long had he been watching? "Doesn't suit you, this weather," Christie called, his tone light, conversational, as if they were discussing the price of coal. "Damp gets into the joints, ruins the wood, ruins everything eventually." Mix opened his mouth, closed it. His throat felt lined with cotton. "It's just fog," he managed, the words thin and brittle. Fog is water, and water rots. Christie shifted the trunk, adjusting his grip without breaking eye contact. Some things are better kept dry, buried deep, don't you agree? He turned back to the house. The trunk scraped again. 4, 5, 6. Mix counted the steps to the threshold, his mind snagging on the number. 13 steps from the lamp to the porch. Christie paused on the 13th. He did not look back. He simply waited, a statue in a grey suit, until the silence stretched tight enough to snap. Then he unlocked the door, no fumble, no hesitation. The key turned with a click that carried up to the window, sharp as a bone breaking. Mick stepped back from the glass. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in. He walked to the washstand, pouring water from the pitcher into the basin. The liquid splashed, loud in the quiet. He scrubbed his hands, rubbing until the skin turned raw and red, but the feeling of dust remained under his nails. White residue, lime. He had seen it on Christie's cuffs earlier that week, a powdery stain that refused to brush away. Downstairs, the floorboards creaked, not the random settling of an old house, but the deliberate weight of a man moving furniture. Drag, stop, drag, stop. Mix dried his hands on the towel, counting the rubs, 7, 8, 9, before he stopped at 10. Never finish the set, for it is bad luck to finish the set when the house was listening. He returned to the window. The street was empty again, the fog rolling thicker, hiding the curb, hiding the gutter. Only the glow from Christie's kitchen window remained, a yellow square cutting the dark. Inside that room, something heavy had landed, a thud that vibrated through the brickwork, up the frame, into Mix's teeth. He gripped the sill. The wood was rough, splintered near the latch. "Mr. Cellini." A whisper from the hallway. Mix spun round. His own door stood ajar, though he remembered shutting it. Mrs. Gable from the ground floor peered in, her face a map of wrinkles and worry. She clutched a letter to her chest, the envelope crumpled in her fist. "Did you see him?" she asked, voice trembling. "Mr. Christie, just now." Mix nodded, carrying a trunk. In this fog, she stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a nervous click. "He gave me a letter, said it was from the Evanses, but Mrs. Evans left weeks ago. Everyone knows they left." She held out the envelope. The postmark was fresh, dated yesterday. "How can they post letters from nowhere, Mr. Cellini? The dead don't write." Mix took the envelope, the paper cold and damp with mist. He turned it over to find the handwriting shaky and uneven. This was not Beryl's hand, for he had seen her writing on the rent book, neat and looping. This was jagged, forced. "Burn it," Mrs. Gable whispered. "Please, it feels wrong, like holding a piece of ice." She left quickly, scurrying down the hall, her footsteps fading into the creak of the stairs. Mix stood alone, the letter burning in his hand. He walked to the grate, holding the envelope over the cold ashes. Fire would destroy it, evidence gone, but the postmark remained in his mind, a number that didn't fit the sum. Yesterday, after they left, after the police came, after the silence started. He placed the letter on the desk instead, for opening it felt like breaking a seal on a tomb. He reached for the knife just as the fog shifted outside. The yellow light in Christie's kitchen flickered once, then twice, before darkness swallowed the house whole. This left Mix staring at the blank window, the knife hovering over the paper, knowing that whatever was written inside would change the count forever. Mrs. Gable did not wait for an answer. Her skirt swished, a dry rustle against the floorboards, and she was gone, leaving the door ajar to the gloom of the landing. The draft from the hall carried the smell of boiled cabbage and wet wool, the standard scent of the building, but beneath it lay something sharper. Acid, like vinegar spilled on limestone. Mick stood frozen, the envelope heavy in his palm, colder than the room allowed. He turned the paper over. The crest of the post office was stamped in black ink, crisp and undeniable. London W10, 14 of 1953, yesterday. Beryl Evans had vanished into the grey weeks ago, taken by her husband, or so the neighbourhood whispered, fled to Scotland or perhaps just fled, but she had not posted a letter from the ether. The dead do not buy stamps. They do not lick the gum on the flap. Mix ran his thumb over the seal. It held firm. To open it was a crime. Section 56 of the Post Office Act. Interfering with Her Majesty's mail carried a penalty, a fine or perhaps time inside, and Mix had spent a lifetime avoiding the attention of men in uniforms. Rules were the only wall between order and the flood. Yet the date glared at him, a numerical impossibility. He moved to the desk, pushing aside a stack of ledgers where he tracked the comings and goings of the house on Rillington Place. The ink on his own pages was dry, factual. Christie out 0900, Christie in 1730, no visitors. He placed the envelope on the blotter. It looked innocent enough, cream-colored, standard issue, but the handwriting twisted across the front. Mrs. Gable, Rillington Place. The loops were too tight, the downstrokes pressing through the paper as if the writer wanted to carve the wood beneath. Beryl's hand had been light, airy. This was forced. A man trying to mimic a woman's grip, pressing too hard, betraying the strength in his wrist. Mix picked up the letter opener. Brass, cold, dull, he hesitated. The ritual demanded he count to 3 before cutting. 1, 2, he stopped. Bad luck to cut on an even number when the house was holding secrets. He waited, listening to the settling of the building, the groan of pipes, the distant rumble of a bus on the Harrow Road. Nothing, just the fog pressing against the glass like a living thing. He sliced the envelope open. The paper inside was single sheet, cheap stock, carrying a message so brief it barely qualified as one. Dear Mrs. Gable, do hope the noise last night did not disturb you. Moving things about. Best regards, B. Evans. Mix read it twice. While the words made sense individually, polite, neighborly, the context rotted them from the inside out. Noise last night, moving things about. There had been no noise, for the building had slept, or perhaps only pretended to. And Beryl would never refer to herself by an initial, being a woman who signed her name in full, proud of it, owning it. This was a forgery, clumsy and desperate, designed to keep the tenants quiet and maintain the illusion that the flat above was occupied by the living rather than the stored. A vehicle backfired outside, a sharp crack that sounded like a pistol shot. Mix jumped, the letter fluttering from his fingers to the floor. He stared at it. The truth sat there, black on white, screaming silently. Christie was not just hiding the absence of the Evanses, he was actively fabricating their presence, weaving a net of lies to catch the curious. And Mix had touched it, held it, complicit now just by knowing. He needed to verify the postmark, the source. If the letter had been posted yesterday, there would be a record at the sorting office, a clerk who remembered the hand that dropped it through the slot. Logic dictated he go there, demand to see the ledger, show them the anomaly, but the thought of walking into the bright, sterile light of the post office, of speaking to an official, made his stomach turn. They would ask questions. Why did he have the letter? How did he obtain it? They would see the obsession in his eyes, the way his hands twitched, and they would dismiss him as another crackpot from the rooming houses. Respectability was a shield Christie wore perfectly. Mix had no such armor. He grabbed his coat. The wool was damp, clinging to his shoulders. He had to try. The numbers would not balance otherwise. The equation of the street was broken, and only the source could fix it. He took the stairs 2 at a time, ignoring the 13th tread, skipping it entirely in his haste. The superstition felt trivial now, a child's game compared to the adult horror of a forged signature. The fog outside was thicker than before, swallowing the street lamps whole. The world had shrunk to the radius of his own footsteps. He walked briskly, head down, colliding with a cold, wet woolen curtain that clung to his skin. The post office was 3 streets away, a brick fortress glowing warmly against the gloom. Inside, the air smelled of glue and dust, a dry, official scent that coated the throat. Only 2 counters were open. An elderly man with spectacles sat behind the glass, sorting stamps with tweezers. He looked up as Mix approached, his expression blank, guarded. "Post," the clerk asked, voice flat. "No information." Mix placed the envelope on the counter, sliding it under the glass partition. "This letter, posted yesterday, I need to know who handed it in." The clerk did not touch the envelope. After glancing at it, he looked back at Mix with eyes that narrowed slightly. "Confidential matter, sir." He invoked the sanctity of the post. "You know the rules." "It's a forgery," Mix said, his voice rising to echo off the tiled floor. "The person who wrote it is dead, or perhaps just gone, leaving someone else to use their name to deceive the neighbors." He slammed his hand down. "It's evidence." "Evidence for whom?" The clerk resumed his sorting, the tweezers clicking against the metal tray. Click, 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 a rhythmic, indifferent sound. "Unless you have a warrant from the Metropolitan Police, I cannot discuss the posting habits of our customers. Mr. Christie is a respected tenant, pays his bills, takes his parcels." You know him, Mix leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass. You know he's lying. I know he buys stamps, the clerk said, not looking up. And I know I have a job to keep. Next, please. A woman stepped up behind Mix, clutching a package, her eyes darting away from his face. She smelled of lavender and fear. Mix stood his ground for a second, the urge to smash the glass overwhelming, to scream the numbers until they listened. But the clerk's indifference was a wall thicker than the brick. He was just a man behind glass, protecting the system, the great machine of the post that moved millions of letters without questioning the hands that mailed them. To breach, it was to admit chaos. Mix took the envelope back. His fingers trembled. He turned and walked out into the fog, the letter crumpled in his fist. The cold air hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. He had nothing, no proof, just a piece of paper that proved nothing to anyone but himself. The isolation settled over him, heavier than the mist. He was alone with the knowledge, a solitary witness to a crime that the world refused to see. The walk back felt endless, every shadow stretching while every puddle reflected a distorted version of the street. When he reached Rillington Place, the house loomed out of the white void, darker than the surrounding terraces. Number 10 was silent. There was no light in the front window, no sound of movement, just the stillness of a tomb. Mix stopped at the gate, looking up first at his own window and then at Christie's. The yellow glow was gone, and the house was dead. Then a flicker. Deep in the rear of the ground floor, behind the net curtains, a single point of light appeared. Not the electric bulb, too soft, too wavering, a candle. It moved across the window, casting a long, dancing shadow against the fabric. A shape, a man bent over, digging. The motion was rhythmic, repetitive, lift, strike, like a man working the earth or breaking through wood. Mix gripped the iron railings, the cold metal biting into his palm. The fog swirled, hiding the street, hiding the escape, leaving him alone in the dark with the man who counted nothing but the dead. The candle flared, illuminating the silhouette of an arm raised high, poised to strike again, and Mix knew the counting had only just begun. Sentence 1, the glass partitions separated them, a cold barrier of institutional indifference that no amount of shouting could shatter. Keep mostly the same, maybe tighten slightly if needed, but the instruction focuses on the number 10 phrase. I should ensure the whole paragraph flows well. Sentence 2, Mix stared at the clerk's hands, pale and pale-skinned, moving with a mechanical precision that mirrored the terrifying order of number 10. Fix redundancy, pale and pale-skinned, pale or bloodless. Fix forbidden phrase, mirrored the terrifying order of number 10. Mr. Christie is a respected tenant, the clerk repeated, the words dropping like stones into a dry well. Pays his bills, takes his parcels. Respected, the word hung in the air, toxic and heavy. It was the same shield Christie used on the pavement, the same armor that allowed him to walk past police officers with a nod and a smile while carrying the weight of the dead in his pockets. Respectability was the currency here, and Mix was bankrupt. He looked down at the envelope in his hand, the paper now soft from his sweat, the ink of Beryl Evans's name blurring under the pressure of his thumb. It was a ghost writing to the living, a message from the grave posted by a man who dug holes in his kitchen floor. He's not who you think he is, Mix said, his voice lower now, stripped of the anger that had fueled him on the walk over. It sounded pathetic, even to his own ears, a whisper against the roar of the post office machinery. The woman who wrote this, she's gone, days ago, weeks, maybe longer. The clerk finally looked up, his eyes magnified behind thick lenses, devoid of curiosity or fear. There was only boredom, a deep, entrenched weariness born of processing millions of letters that all claimed to be urgent, all claimed to be true. We do not verify the vitality of the sender, sir, only the postage. If the stamp is valid, the letter moves. That is the contract. The contract, Mix laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that made the woman behind him flinch. There's a murderer posting letters in my street, and you talk about contracts. I talk about my job, the clerk corrected, placing the tweezers down with deliberate care. He reached for a rubber stamp, a heavy block of wood that he slammed onto an ink pad. Thud. The sound echoed like a gavel. And my job is to ensure the post arrives, not to play detective with every eccentric who walks through that door. Next, please. The dismissal was absolute. a wall of brick and regulation that Mix could not climb. He felt the eyes of the woman on his back, sensing her discomfort, her desire to be anywhere but near this manic man with the crumpled letter and the wild eyes. She smelled of lavender water and damp wool, a scent of domestic normalcy that felt alien in this place of cold efficiency. She wanted to believe the clerk. She needed to believe that the system worked, that the post was sacred, that a man like Christie could not exist within the orderly rows of a London street. To admit otherwise was to admit that the fog could swallow anyone, that the monster was not in a storybook, but in the flat next door, paying his bills and buying his stamps. Mix stepped back from the counter. His legs felt unsteady, as if the floor had tilted while he wasn't looking. He clutched the envelope to his chest, protecting the evidence that was no evidence at all. Just paper, just ink, just a lie wrapped in an official stamp. The clerk had already turned away, his attention consumed by the next customer, the next letter, the next mundane transaction that kept the world spinning. The sanctity of the post was a beautiful, terrible lie. It protected the living, yes, but it also protected the dead who were forced to write home long after their throats had been cut. He turned and walked out. The fog hit him again, thicker now, pressing against his face like a wet cloth. The streetlights were mere halos in the grey soup, useless beacons that guided no one. He walked without direction, his feet finding the pavement by memory rather than sight. The cobblestones were slick, reflecting the distorted glow of the shops, turning the familiar route into a surreal landscape of shifting shadows. Every step felt wrong. The rhythm was broken. He should be counting them. 1, 2, 3, but the numbers wouldn't stick. They slid off his mind like rain off a waxed coat. 3 streets, 4, 5, he lost count. The panic rose in his throat, a hot acidic tide that threatened to choke him. If he couldn't count what was left, just the fear, just the knowledge that he was alone with a secret too large to carry. He stumbled over a curb, catching himself against a lamp post, the cold iron biting into his palm. Pain, real, sharp pain, it grounded him, pulled him back from the edge of the spiral. He straightened his coat, smoothed his hair, and forced his breathing to slow. In, out, a new count, a safer one. Rillington Place emerged from the mist like a shipwreck, the terrace houses huddled together against the damp. Number 10 stood apart, darker than the rest, a void in the row of lit windows. The neighbors were drawing their curtains, shutting out the night, shutting out the cold, shutting out the possibility that something rot festered behind the painted wood of number 10. They trusted the post. They trusted the respectability of the man who lived there. They did not know about the letter in Mix's pocket, the letter that proved the dead could still write if a living hand held the pen. Mix stopped at his own gate, his eyes fixed on the front of Christie's house. Nothing moved. No sound escaped the brickwork. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket smothering the street. He waited, watching, counting the seconds in his head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 13. A flicker appeared in the rear window, low down near the floor. Not the steady burn of an electric bulb, but the wavering, dancing glow of a flame. A candle. It moved sideways, then stopped, then dipped as a shadow stretched across the net curtain, elongated and grotesque. An arm rose high, holding something heavy, a tool, a weapon. The shadow struck downwards in a violent, jerking motion that repeated, lifting and striking with rhythmic, relentless force like a man digging or breaking wood or bone. The street lamp above Mix buzzed, a dying insect sound, and then went dark. The plunge into blackness was sudden, total. The rest of the terrace followed, plunging Rillington Place into a deep, unnatural night. Only number 10 remained lit, the single candle burning bright against the void, a beacon signaling the location of the horror. Mix gripped the iron railing, his knuckles white, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps that fogged the air. He could not look away. The shadow struck again, and this time, through the thin fabric of the curtain, he heard it. Not the sound of wood splitting, but the wet, heavy thud of earth being moved, or flesh. The candle flared, illuminating the profile of a man bent over the floor, his face obscured by the angle while his purpose remained clear in the brutal repetition of his movement. Christie was not resting, he was working, and the post would deliver his lies tomorrow, just as it had today, just as it would until the walls themselves gave up their dead. Mix took a step forward, then stopped. Where was he going? To knock, to accuse, or to be dismissed again as a madman? The candle flickered, casting a long shadow that seemed to reach out across the garden towards him, an invitation or a warning. He stood frozen, the letter burning a hole in his pocket, the count in his head shattered, while the silence of the street screamed in his ears. The digging stopped, the shadow straightened, and the candle blew out, leaving Mix alone in the dark, with the sound of his own heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat counting down to something he could not name. Although the rain had ceased, the pavement retained a slick grease that reeked of wet flagstones and rotting cabbage, clinging to Notting Hill like wool left to sour in the drizzle. Mixellini leaned his forehead against the frosted glass, his breath blooming on the surface as he watched Gwyneth Pratchett fiddle with the strap of her handbag until the leather dug into the navy wool of her coat. She halted beneath a cream cardigan before the peeling paint of the notorious row house, where the doors stood somber and hollow within the grey, weeping facade of Rillington Place. The brassy knocker, polished to an almost cruel gleam, threw back the distorted face of a stranger, while Mix counted his own heartbeats against the chill of the windowpane. A superstitious shiver pricked the nape of his neck, yet the true weight of silence belonged to the officers churning the garden mud beyond the fence, hunting for what the biting autumn air had already swallowed whole. "Go on then," Gwyneth whispered to her reflection, the words snatched by the damp air before they could settle, for there was no pillar box to receive such an offering, only the heavy quiet pressing against ears stuffed with cotton wool, while police tape remained strung across the gate despite the muttering that circled the block. She lifted her hand and knocked 3 sharp times upon the timber, the sound echoing down the street as if striking bone rather than wood, yet no answer followed at once. The Count felt truncated, wrong, the atmosphere itself screaming for a fourth beat to right the rhythm before she let her arm drop, seized by a sudden compulsion to flee. Inside, footsteps approached with a slow, deliberate tread that moved through unseen rooms until the lock slid back with an oiled ease suggesting familiarity rather than any official entry. In Mix's vision, the uniforms dissolved. A man in a mackintosh stood motionless whilst Mix pressed closer, his breath clouding the pane until the glass overlaid reality with a grey suit and a sharp jaw, wire-rimmed spectacles catching the hall's gloom to mask the eyes of John Christie. "Miss Pratchett," the voice intoned, a deep rumble that filled the narrow throat of the hall and pulled her into a chill where the cold found immediate purchase. The figure retreated, beckoning towards a corridor where the air hung thick with lavender polish and the smell of wet earth, like a graveyard caught in the first frost. Gwyneth hesitated, her shoe hovering on threshold that divided the public street from private shadow, whilst Mix's knuckles whitened against the sill, willing her to run, yet remaining rooted himself, trapped between the pull-off polite convention and the grim business-off excavation. "I have a note," she offered, clutching the envelope like Ashield against the gathering dark. Speaking of Mrs. Miller's coal, Bill Wylath, master of the house, smiled thinly, his gaze offering refuge from the draught even as it claimed light from the gas fire that warmed the room. His hand, pale and dry as parchment, guided her forward until the door clicked with a shuttered finality, leaving theme upon linoleum worn smooth in its center, marking the distinct paths to the scullery and the rising stairs. "Expenses," came the quiet directive. Ashy's hand rested on the banister, the wood gleaming weakly from years of use. "Do leave the kettle tobble." She slipped the coat from her shoulders, revealing walls yellowed by smoke against the dark skirting, the white paint a violent, jarring contrasto, the layers of grime that masked the scent of damp, rissing like a miasma. Gwyneth's gaze fixed upon the staircase, the first step looming large as she began to climb, recalling the idle chatter and trivial comforts of lodging house life. Numbers seemed to merge in the scent, accompanied by the calm clatter of crockery and the square Akoff leather soles. A high, tearing screech that ripped the silence while the air grew heavy with a sweet tang of blood and draught beneath the polish. Nausea turned her stomach as the host emerged from the shadows, his expression perfectly polite as he commanded her to sit, the gloom closing in around them. The cooling glass snapped Mix's cheek from the trance, revealing a constable bellowing orders in the street below, the phantom mackintosh dissolving into nothingness. Gwyneth still stood wet in the grey afternoon, facing an empty road, with 13 dark steps waiting inside the house. The 13th Stair is not a documentary record. It is a work of historical fiction, grounded in the real case and historical record of John Christie 10 Rillington Place. Its central figures and events are real and the dates, places and outcomes are faithful to the record. The dialogue, the private scenes and the interiors are imagined, dramatized, not documented. Where the story departs from the verifiable facts, the liberty is the author's own. The history behind it draws on these real sources. John Christie, serial killer. 10. Rillington Place. Primary material researched via the Internet Archive. Context via Wikipedia.